The snow beneath my leather boots did not crunch, it shattered. The heavy frost covering the expanse's marble veranda of the packhouse broke like fragile glass under my weight, the sound echoing loud and sharp in the silence of the winter dawn. I adjusted the frayed canvas strap of my single travel bag over my shoulder. The bitter northern wind whipped across the frozen valley, absolute sterile wind. My heart maintained a slow, clinical, entirely undisturbed rhythm. The frantic, weeping girl who had once worshipped the ground this estate was built upon no longer existed. The massive oak double doors behind me violently exploded open. The heavy iron hinges groaned in agonizing protest as Alpha King Thorn threw his massive frame on the threshold. The barometric pressure on the veranda instantly plummeted. A suffocating, terrifying wave of pure crashed in the freezing air, laced heavily with the sharp, hot metallic tang, a sudden visceral panic. For a decade, that heavy, arrogant cedar scent had been my gravity. It had been the invisible, suffocating leash that forced my chin down and demanded my absolute, devoted submission. He stood framed in the ruined doorway, his massive chest heaving rapidly beneath his unbuttoned linen shirt. The pristine white snow began to melt rapidly around his bare feet, actively vaporized by the sheer unhinged body heat radiating from his towering frame. His rich amber eyes were completely blown out, the pupils swallowing the iris entirely as they bled into violent, glowing, dominant crimson. He was the invincible apex predator of the Western continent. He did not ask, he did not plead. Stop walking. It was not a spoken phrase, it was an alpha command of apocalyptic proportions. The invisible, crushing wave of psychic pressure erupted violently from his body, designed to drop massive rogue armies to their knees and shatter the iron will of any subordinate wolf. It was a localized biological earthquake of absolute, terrifying authority, intending to slam directly into my spine, force my knees violently into the ice, and bare my throat to him in helpless, frantic surrender. The invisible shockwave hit the center of my back. The absolute, impenetrable permafrost residing in my chest did not even ripple. There was no desperate, instinctual urge to obey. My inner wolf did not whimper in the dark. My inner wolf was completely, permanently dead. The heavy, suffocating wave of his ancient, royal commands struck the sterile, empty void of my biology and simply disintegrated into worthless, dead static. It passed completely through my flesh, like a cold winter draft sweeping through a forgotten, empty tomb. I did not pause my stride, I did not flinch, I did not turn my head to look at him. I smooth shifted my weight and took another deliberate, unbothered step down the seed marble stairs. The biologic impossibility of a bonded mate actively ignoring a direct blood fueled alpha command hit his nervous system like a physical concussion. The silence that instant flooded the veranda was not empty. It was the terrifying, heavy stillness of a god realizing his gravity no longer possessed the power to hold his own universe together. He had demanded my submission, and I had handed him nothing but the void. Before we continue with my story, tell me, which country are you listening from? Comment below. Let me know where my silence has reached. The freeze wind was a welcome comfort, a sharp, biting contrast to the searing, phantom agony that still pulsed deep beneath my ribs. It was a ghost of memory from a timeline that had burned to ash just hours ago. In that lost, forgotten reality, the winter snow had not remained pristine and white. It had been violently painted with my own blood. I remembered the heavy, suffocating scent of the western border. Thorn had ordered me there. He claimed it was a diplomatic gesture to the neighboring human logging settlements, an escort mission to project the benevolent, merciful grace of the Luna. It was a lie. It was a calculated, theatrical stage set by a king who felt his omega slipping from his absolute, suffocating control. I had been asking too many questions. I had been craving a life outside the gilded, heavily guarded cage of his dominant cedar scent. He needed to remind me why I required his protection. He needed me terrified, fragile, and utterly pendant. The rogues had poured from the northern tree line like starved, rabid shadows. Their pheromones hit my nose like a fizzle blow, a nauseating, suffocating wave of wet fur, rotting meat, and blind, feral starvation. My royal enforcer escorts were slaughtered in seconds, their throats torn open before they could even draw their broadswords. I had turned to run. My frantic omega instinct screamed. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, a desperate, rapid rhythm of pure terror. I threw mind outward, blind plunging into the golden, buzzing network of the pack mind. I screamed for my mate. I begged for the invincible Alpha King to tear through the forest and save me. The psychic connection snapped open. But the mental channel did not flood with a frantic panic. It did not vibrate with a protective world, enrage of an alpha rushing to defend his mate. It was sickeningly, terrifyingly calm. A heavy, dark, suffocating dominance rolled lazily through the psychic spectator. He was not miles away in the grand hall. He was close. He was watching. The realization tasted like copper and bile on my tongue. He had hired the mercenaries. He had orchestrated the entire massacre purely to play the savior. And to ensure his sick, twisted script went exactly as he planned. To guarantee I would not run into the deeper woods and ruin his grand entrance, he dropped the full, crushing weight of his alpha command directly onto my spine. Stay exactly where you are. The psychic command echoed in my skull. It was heavy, graviducing, absolute. My knees buckled instantly. I violently forced my body to the frozen earth in absolute, uncontrollable submission to my king. I could not move my arms. I could not lift my head from the dirt. The psychic pressure was so immense, so paralyzing, it felt as though a massive, invisible mountain had been dropped directly onto my back. I lay completely paralyzed in the snow, a helpless captive audience to my own execution. The rogues did not know the script. They were starved, unhinged beasts, driven purely by feral hunger. They did not wait for the Alpha King to dramatically emerge from the timber and play the hero. The lead rogue lunged, his massive jaws clamped directly on the back of my neck. The pain was an apocalyptic explosion of white heat. I felt my flesh tear. I felt the cervical bone splinter under his teeth. Hot blood sprayed across the freezing dirt. But the physical agony was entirely eclipsed by the catastrophic spiritual ruin happening inside my soul. My inner wolf, the sweet, yielding Omega spirit that had loved him with a blind, pathetic, desperate devotion for 10 agonizing years, realized the truth. It was our mate holding us down. His command was the invisible chain trapping us in the slaughter. She did not fight back. She did not howl. The sheer, incomprehensible betrayal. She curled into a tight, shivering ball deep within my subconscious. She let out one final, pathetic she died. The sitter, sunades, keen warm scent. Cyanide defined sign my identity evaporated from my pores in a single second. I bled out in the snow, paralyzed by a monster, until the darkness swallowed me completely. Then my eyes snapped open. I was staring at the velvet canopy of the master den. It was exact 6 hours before the fatal border patrol. The temporal regression was an impossible, miraculous glitch in the universe. But the miracle was entirely sterile. My body had traveled backward through time, but my inner wolf had remained dead in that bloody snowbank. The trauma had triggered a dormant, deep-rooted evolutionary failsafe, the Omega nullification. My biologic receptors for the pack hierarchy were permanently calcified. The pack link in my mind, once a constant buzzing hive of anxious demands, was completely, beautifully silent. The crushing weight of alpha dominance was nothing more than a passing breeze against a stone wall. I was a ghost water in a living body. I stepped off the final marble stair of the veranda, the soles of my boots meeting the packed snow of the courtyard. The memory of my death faded back in the cold, clinical vault of my mind. Behind me, the silence of the grand estate was prevalent, unnatural. The heavy, dominant cedar scent that Thorn had just violently projected did not linger in the freezing air. It violently soured. It rapidly decayed in the harsh, acrid stench of forest fire, a heavy, suffocating cloud of burning wood, feral terror, and the sharp, hot copper of an animal caught in steel trap. A wet, horrifying sound ripped through the quiet dawn. It was the sound of massive cardiovascular system actively tearing itself apart. The canvas strap of my travel bag bit dull physical pressure that perfectly grounded me in the present moment. I had not packed the heavy, ancestral silver Luna crown. I had not packed the delicate spun, silk dresses Thorn had draped over my shoulders for a decade, garments designed to display my court like a prized fragile porcelain doll. My bag contained 3 thick woolen sweaters, a pair of worn leather riding trousers, and a simple unadorned iron hunting knife. I was walking away from most powerful and heavily fortified empire in the West and from Tali, with her but the clothes on my back and a heart forged from solid, impenetrable ice. Earlier that morning, when I had slipped the dark sheet of the master den, the profoundity of my reality bodies settled deep into my mallee had settled teed my marrow. The traumatic temporal regression had not just saved my life, it had fundamentally, permanently mutated my species. Thorn had been asleep, his massive, heavily scarred arm slung over the empty space where my waist used to be. For 10 agonizing years, the sheer proximity of his resting body would send my omega instincts in a frantic, dizzying spiral of desperate devotion. The rich, dominant cedar scent rolling off his heated skin used to be an intoxicating metabolic tether that kept my mind heavily sedated and utterly compliant. But as I stood at the foot of the bed in the pre-dawn darkness, carefully folding my plain woolen sweaters, he inhaled deeply. Nothing. The heavy cedar did not wrap around my lungs. It did not trigger the warm, submissive flush of spun honey and sweet almond that had defined my entire biologic identity. The air was just sterile, empty air. The omega nullification was not merely the absence of an inner wolf. It was the active, aggressive calcification of every psychic and biological in my body. It was an extreme evolutionary failsafe. The body keeps the score when the mind cannot escape. To survive the apocalyptic betrayal of a mate orchestrating my slaughter, my biology had violently terminated its Rapaka connection. My inner wolf had died in that phantom snowbank so that the woman could walk away. In the intricate hypersensitive world of shifter dynamic, T-emality are entirely dictated by aura, an alpha project gravity and absolute law, a beta project stability and enforcement, an omega project's warmth, healing, and submission. These invisible frequencies are the foundation of our entire species, a constant, buzzing network of hierarchical data that dictates every breath, every height, and every physical interaction. Without my inner wolf, I was a biological black hole. I possessed no aura. I projected no frequency. The psychic tether that once anchored me Thorn's mind, a heavy, suffocating golden chain of alpha dominance that he used to monitor my emotions, had dissolved in total nothingness. The pack link, which normally hummed at the base of my skull with the collected anxieties, joys, and territorial aggression of thousands of wolves, complete, beautifully dead. The silence inside my head was no longer a cage. It was an endless, bottomless, frozen ocean. It was a terrifying, magnificent vacuum. The nullification rendered me completely immune to the ancient laws of our kind. I continued my steady, unhurried pace across the snow-covered courtyard, my boots leaving shallow, perfectly spaced indentations in the white frost. I approached the massive wrought iron gates of the estate perimeter. 4 elite royal enforcers stood at absolute tension beneath the towery stone archway, their heavy broadswords strapped tightly to their armored thighs. These were the most lethal, highly disciplined hunters on the continent. They were men genetically engineered to detect the microscopic scent of a rogue from miles away. They were strict commanded to guard the Luna with their lives, to track her every movement, and to never let her pass the boundary, unescorted. I walked directly past them. I stepped so close I could have reached out and brushed the freezing iron of their shoulder plates. They did not blink. Their golden eyes stared straight ahead, completely unbothered by my proximity. Their highly trained olfactory nerves swept the freezing morning wind and registered absolute brains. Their pride monarchal subverting her king was not the lunar deserter kings. I was not even a living, breathing entity. I was the scent of dead pine needles and cold stones. I was a fleeting trick of the pale winter light. Without a biological frequency to anchor me their reality, this tier similitude did not compute. The sheer calculated utility of my dead biology was impeccable, flawless armor. I walked through the highest security perimeter in the Empire as a ghost. I passed the heavy iron gates and stepped on the packed dirt of the northern trail. The boundary line of the Western Empire lay just 50 yards ahead, marked by the dense towering canopy of the ancient timberline. The air here was noticeably thinner, sharper. It did not carry the suffocating, oppressive weight of Thorn's territorial claim. Every step I took felt like severing a microscopic rotting thread that had kept my soul bound to the earth. My cold independence was absolute, required no warmth from a pack fire, it required no protection from a king. I was the winter. The dark shadows of the tree line, The dark shadows of the heavy pines stretched out across the snow to welcome me, offering a perfect, undisturbed isolation. But the horrific wet sound of cardiovascular destruction erupting from the veranda behind me did not fade in the distance. It violently escalated. A sudden, catastrophic shockwave of pure biological panic enters the valley air, ripping through the quiet morning like a physical detonation. The invincible Alpha King was not just falling to his knees in the snow. The absolute impossible defiance of my silent had violently rebounded his act command, and the catastrophic whiplash was rapidly tearing his internal organs. I was exactly 50 yards past the Grand Iron Gates when the biological catastrophe finally hit the Alpha King. I did not turn around. I did not break my steady, unhurried stride. My gaze remained fixed entirely on the dark, heavy shadows of the northern timberline waiting to swallow me. But I did not need to see the grand veranda to know exactly what was happening to the invincible god of the Western Valley. My senses, permanently stripped of the chaotic noise of the pack link, were now clinically, terrifyingly sharp. Every shift in the air pressure, every subtle vibration in the frozen earth, painted a flawless, invisible picture of his execution. An alpha command is not merely a loud, arrogant shout. It is a highly weaponized projection of concentrated psychic mass. It is a fundamental biological law forged in the ancient bloodlines of kings, designed to travel flawlessly through the golden, sacred tether of the mate bond. When Thorn roared for me to stop, he funneled the entire, colossal weight of his dominant fury in that psychic channel. He expected that massive pressure to wrap around my spine, to forcefully buckle my knees in the ice, and to demand my desperate, weeping apology. But my end of the tether was a permanent graveyard. My inner wolf was completely dead. When his immense crushing command struck the absolute, impenetrable permafrost of my void, it found absolute no vessel to absorb it. The psychic energy struck a bottomless vacuum and instantly, violently rebounded. In shifter biology, an unanchored command of that terrifying magnitude does not simply dissipate harmlessly in the morning air. It snaps back. It returned along the fractured pathway with the catastrophic multiplied force of a derailed freight train, slamming directly in the very nervous system that had generated. It slammed directly into Thorn's own heart. The sickening, wet sound of massive internal violently rupturing echoed across the frozen courtyard. It was a horrific, tearing crunch of dense muscle and thick cartilage giving way. A deep, guttural shockwave of displaced air tore through the crisp winter morning, popping the eardrums of the royal guards stationed at the perimeter gates. I kept walking, the pristine snow crunch soft beneath my worn leather boots. One deliberate step, two deliberate steps. Behind me, the towering, unstoppable monarch collapsed entirely, the heavy, thundering crash of his massive body hitting the frozen marble of the veranda shook the earth beneath my feet. The impact was entirely uncontrolled. He did not brace his fall, with his thick catch his massive weight, heavily scarred arms. The catastrophic biological whiplash had instant paralyzed his advanced motor functions. The invincible Alpha King fell like a slaughtered ox, his broad, powerful shoulders slamming brutally against the ice-stone steps. Then came the blood. I could hear the violent, erratic hitching of his massive chest. His dense lungs were desperately trying to pull in oxygen, but they were rapidly filling with heavy fluid. A horrific, wet hacking sound tore through the quiet dawn. It was a manic, suffocating, drowned cough. The scent hit Sufrine's in a fraction of a second later, complete overtaking the sterile, clean pine. It was an appalling, nauseating stench. The rich, dominant cedar that had demanded my absolute worship for a decade was completely annihilated. It was violently replaced entirely by the smell of burnt ash, rapidly decaying meat, and the hot, raw copper of a massive internal hemorrhage. Thorn was vomiting black blood directly in the pristine white snow. It was not the bright, oxygenated crimson red a clean battlefield wound. It was thick, toxic, necrotic sludge. It was the physical, gruesome biological manifestation of his shattered dominance and his actively rotting soul. The severed mate bond, completely starved of my omega submission, violent poison by his own rebounded command, was actively cannibalizing his cardiovascular system. His ancient royal blood was literally turning to poison in his own veins. The profound silence of the estate completely shattered. It was not broken by a commanding royal roar, but by the apocalyptic panic of his empire. The 4 elite enforcers at the iron gates, who mere moments ago had completely ignored my biologically invisible presence, suddenly dropped to their heavy knees in the dirt. Their thick armored hands flew frantically to their chest. They let out sharp, ragged gasps of pure, unadulterated agony. The catastrophic rupture of Thorn's heart was actively transmitting a massive, agonizing shock high against entire possibly our pack. Thousands of wolves inside the sprawl estate were suddenly waking up screaming in their beds, violently clutching their ribs as their alpha's biology tore itself apart. I reached the edge of the tree line. The dark, heavy branches of the ancient pines reached out, casting a thick, protective shadow over my path. I paused just before crossing into the absolute dark. My pulse remained a slow, clinical, flawless metronome. The thick permafrost in my chest did not thaw. I did not feel a single microscopic pang of sorrow for the man choking on his own toxic blood just 100 yards behind me. I felt absolutely nothing. The ledger was simply balancing itself. A terrifying, pathetic sound drifted on the bitter wind, cutting cleanly through the chaotic shouts of the royal guards rushing the veranda. It was Thorn. He was entirely stripped of his commanding resonance, his heavy vocal cords, coated Adian triad, weed out a ragged, high, pitched whine. It was the desperate, feral, agonizing sound of a dying pup left entirely alone in the freezing dark. He was actively suffocating, his invincible, immortal body completely broken by my absolute silence. I stepped over the boundary line. The shadows of the timber swallowed me whole. But just as the heavy frost-covered brush closed behind my dark cloak, a sudden, erratic vibration pulsed through the frozen earth directly beneath the sole of my boot. A frantic, manic, terrified rhythm of a dying beast beginning to crawl. The rusted iron hinges of the Oakhaven Tavern shrieked against the howling northern wind. I sat in the darkest, furthest corner of the tap room. My hands rested flat against the scarred, sticky oak of a forgotten table. A cracked ceramic mug of boiled root water sat entirely untouched before me. The liquid had long since gone completely cold. I did not shiver. The sub-zero draft blowing viciously through the splintered floorboards perfectly matched the absolute, undisturbed permafrost resting heavily in my chest. The neutral tavern was packed with human loggers, unmarked drifters, tallow wax. It smelled of stale tallow wax, sour ale, and wet, unwashed wool. It was a loud, chaotic, entirely unremarkable space. Then, the abstract church in the room violently collapsed. The heavy, reinforced wooden front door did not swing open with the arrogant, thunderous kick of a conquering monarch. It was pushed agonizingly by a trembling, blood-soaked hand. The sickening, toxic cloud of burnt cedar ash, raw feral terror, and rotting copper instant flooded the taproom. It was the heavy, suffocating scent of terminal biological failure. The boisterous, drunken laughter of the human loggers died instantly. The heavy clinking of glass mugs ceased. The stray hounds hiding under the hearth tables began to whimper frantically, pressing their bellies flat against the freezing mud, instinctively terrified by the scent of an apex predator actively decaying. Thorn stepped over the threshold. He was a catastrophic walking ruin. The pristine white linen shirt he had worn on the veranda was cleat-shredded, stained entirely black with the toxic, necrotic, bloody beneath. His heavy midnight velvet coat hung off his massive, trembling shoulders like a filthy, ruined shroud. He's not walking with the terrifying, gravity-inducing stride of an alpha king. He dragged his heavy iron, shod boots awkwardly across the swords. A wet, horrific wheeze rattled deep within his chest with every agonizing inhalation. He had not tracked my scent. I was biological invisible. He'd biologically. He had tracked the absolute terrifying vacuum of my existence. He had dragged his actively hemorrhaging body through 50 miles of brutal, freezing wilderness. Blindly pushing through the blizzard by following the dead zone, the agonizing, gaping hole in his psychic rada, where his mate used to be. His bloodshot, completely blown, out amber eyes frantically scanned the dim, smoky room. They locked on my solitary figure in the corner. The physical reaction of his biology finding me was instantaneous and gruesome. A sharp, violent crack echoed loudly from inside his own ribcage. The severed mate bond, starved for the sweet almond and spun honey it required to survive. violently cannibalized another layer of his conafial system in a desperate futile attempt to force a connection. He dropped heavily to his knees. The impact shook the floorboards. He did not stay down. Driven by pure, unhinged, feral desperation, he planted his bleed hands, filthy, and forced his max of. He stumbled toward my table, his massive chest hitching with short, frantic, inadequate gasps. He stopped exactly 1 foot away from the edge of my table. His massive, trembling hands gripped the scarred oak. His thick fingers left wet, dark smears of black blood against the wood. He stared down at me, his jaw worked frantically, trembling with the sheer, apocalyptic agony of standing in my presence without the protective insulation of my Omega submission. Without my warmth to regulate his nervous system, the raw, unfilled air of the neutral zone felt like inhaling crushed glass. "Look at me." He did not speak the command. He attempted to project it psychically. It was a pathetic, moxicop fraction of his former power, a desperate, dying ember of alpha dominance meant to wrap around my spine and force my chin up to meet his gaze. The heavy frequency hit the absolute, impenetrable wall of my sovereign void. My eyes, once warm, devoted pools of desperate adoration, were entirely dead. They were hollow, clinical, unreadable glass. I did not blink. I simply observed the mechanics of his breakdown with a mild, sterile curiosity. I did not reach out to wipe the black blood from his bruised lips. I did not project a single ounce of comfort. The space between us remained an absolute, freezing vacuum. The sheer cognitive dissonance shattered the last remaining fragment of his sanity. His brain simply refused to compute the dead eyes as Luna. "This table is completely warped." His voice was a raw, wet scrape against the heavy, terrified silence of the tavern. He was not begging me to return to the pack house. He was not apologizing for the massacre he had orchestrated at the border. He completely ignored the colossal, apocalyptic spiritual ruin of our connection. "The wood is splintered. It will catch the wool of your sweater. I need to burn this wood. I will bring the royal carpenters. I will cut down the entire forest and build you a chair of polished mahogany. You cannot sit here. The splinters will cut your wrists." It was the pathetic, obsessive babbling of a man entirely divorced from reality. He was frantically hyper-fixating on the microscopic texture of a cheap wooden table because the reality of my dead soul was too massive, too terrifying for his failing biology to process. He was actively bleeding to death, his heart tearing itself apart, and he was obsessing over a splinter near my cuff. I looked down at his massive, trembling hands gripping the table, slowed my right hand and placed a single coin on the dry edge of the oak to pay for the untouched water. My movements were slow, fluid, and entirely unhurried. Thorne completely stopped breathing, his pupils dilated in absolute, breathless terror. He waited for the instinctual Omega rush. He waited for the frantic dash to his side, the weeping panic over his bloody state. I stepped smoothly around the table. My dark cloak brushed light against the leg of my chair, completely avoiding his massive, ruined frame. But as my shoulder passed his heaving chest, he made a fatal, instinctual error. His massive, blood-soaked hand shot out, his thick fingers desperately brushing the frayed canvas strap of my travel bag. He needed to feel the physical. He needed a single, macroscopic drop of my warmth to restart his dying heart. His skin made contact with the absolute freezing zero of my aura. The sensory shockwave of the dead zone violently electrocuted his nervous system. The contact was microsecond, a fraction of a second, but in the hypersensitivity of our species, skin-to-skin contact between a mated pair is a catastrophic transfer of data. It is the purest, most unfiltered conversation two wolves have. When his thick, blood-stained finger brushed the fraying canvas strap resting against my collarbone, his knuckles grazing the pale skin of my neck, he was desperately seeking the familiar, intoxicating rush of my Omega warmth. He was starving for the soft, yielding spun honey that had always rushed forward to soothe his primal aggression. He expected a spark. He expected the ancient, golden tether of the mate bond to flare to life and pull me back from the edge of my silence. Instead, his highly tuned nervous system slammed headfirst in the absolute, terrifying vacuum of the sovereign void. It was not a physical strike. It was worse. It was the sensory equivalent of stepping off a cliff in the pitch rack and never hitting the ground. There was no resistance, no friction, no emotional frequency to anchor his biological rada. There was only the endless sterile winter of my calcified soul. A horrific wet gag ripped from his throat. He violently yanked his massive hand back, clutching his bruised knuckle against his heavy chest, as if he had plunged his bare fist into a veta of liquid nitrogen. The toxic suffocating stench of his burnt skeeter and rolling the silent spiked, rolling through the silent tavern in a heavy, nauseating wave. His invincible, immortal biology was violent, rejecting the absolute deadness of my aura. The lack of my scent was literally making him physically sick. He staggered backward, his heavy iron, shod boots slipping awkwardly against the filthy floorboards. He doubled over, his broad shoulders heaving, as another wet, rattling cough tore through his ruined lungs. Thick, black droplets of necrotic blood splattered against the scarred oak of the table. I did not reach out to steady him. I did not pull a soft handkerchief from my tuck to wipe the toxic sludge from his chin. My posture relaxed it. I observed the horrific collapse of a god with the sterile, detached boredom of a mortician examining a corpse. His alpha ego, the colossal, deeply entrenched arrogance that had ruled the Western continent for centuries, flared in a final desperate act of primal survival. He could not accept the void. His dominant brain violently deflected the reality of my dead soul. He squeezed his bloodshot amber eyes shut and attempted one last, agonizing projection of his dominant aura. It was not the world-ending, gravity-inducing roar he had unleashed on the frozen veranda. It was a mild, concentrated projection. A psychic demand designed to wrap gently around my mind, to score by calf the trauma saw or force a sudden drop of my sweet almond scent to the surface. It was a desperate plea disguised as an absolute command. Feel me. The invisible frequency pulsed from his bleeding chest. It washed over the terrified human loggers, sending them scrambling backward against the tavern walls. Several of the unmarked drifters collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads in sudden, agonizing pain as the heavy pressure of the Alpha King crushed the oxen out of the room. The frequency hit my chest. It simply vanished. The heavy, dominant dissolved permafrost without a single trace, my permafrost without leaving a single trace. I did blink. I did not feel the phantom weight of his authority. The Omega nullification absorbed the absolute peak of his biological power and returned absolute nothing. The silence inside my head remained a flawless, undisturbed mirror of ice. The sensory shock of his failed projection ricocheted violently back in his skull. Thorn let out a sharp, breathless whine. His massive hands flew to his temples. He pitched forward. A heavy slam brutally into the splintered floorboards directly at my feet. The wood cracked loudly under his immense weight. He was on his knees. The invincible Alpha King of the Western Empire. A man who possessed the internal body heat to survive a blizzard bare-chested, was violent, shuddering in the filthy dirt of a neutral tavern. His violent, unhinged crimson pupils had completely receded, leaving behind the pale, sickly amber of a dying beast. He stared up at me, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. He was hyperventilating, his massive chest hitching with short, frantic, inadequate gasps. He was taking 50 breaths a minute, but he was actively suffocating on dry land. The complete lack of my scent was literally depriving his brain of oxygen. He could not process the absolute, flawless indifference in my hollow eyes. To protect whatever tiny microscopic fragment of his sanity remained, his fractured mind violently pivoted. He poured the entire, catastrophic weight of his biological panic in the frayed canvas strap resting on my shoulder. The canvas is tearing. His voice was a broken, feverish whisper. He did not dare look into my dead eyes again. He stared obsessively at the worn edge of my bag, his bleeding fingers twitching violently in the space between us, desperate to touch but terrified of the freezing burn. The threads are coming loose. The bag will break. Your sweaters will fall in the dirt. You cannot carry this. I will weave you a trunk of solid silver. I will summon the royal tanners. I will skin the beast myself and make you a flawless leather pack. The canvas is too rough against your collarbone. It is bruising your skin. You are bruising. It was the pathetic, obsessive babbling of a man entirely divorced from reality. He was hyperfixating on a loose thread while his own heart was actively tearing itself apart in his chest. He was trying to exert absolute control over a cheap piece of canvas, because he had entirely lost control of his universe. He was actively ignoring the massive, fatal hemorrhage in his lungs to obsess over the hypothetical bruising of my shoulder. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. I looked down at the top of his dark, rain-slicked head. I watched his broad, muscular shoulders shakes with sibiled, violently suppressed sobs as he obsessively tracked the frayed edge of my bag. The white permafrost in my chest did not thaw. It did not even crack. I smooth-stepped around his kneeling, trembling form. I did not say a word. I simply began to walk toward the heavy wooden door of the tavern, leaving him completely alone in the center of the silent, terrified room. But as my hand touched the rusted iron latch, the heavy thud of a massive body hitting the floorboards sounded immediately behind my back. The heavy thud behind my back was the sound of 300 pounds of dense muscles and shattered bone collapsing entirely against splintered floorboards. I pulled the rusted iron latch and stepped out in the freezing night. The brutal northern wind instant whipped the hood of my dark cloak back. But the biting cold gestured only as a mild clinical data point against my skin. The thick permafrost inside my chest maintained a flawless equilibrium. I did not pause to listen for the gasps of the loggers. I did not look over my shoulder to see if the invincible Alpha King was dead. He walked away. The snow beneath my boots was rapidly turning into treacherous ice sludge as the evening blizzard rolled over the logging town. I moved with a steady, unhurried cadence toward a dilapidated boarding house at the edge of the tree line. It was a wretched, half-constructed structure designed for drifters and forgotten exiles. I paid the heavily scarred innkeeper a single copper coin, taking the cold iron key to a room on the top floor. The narrow corridor smelled of rotting pine, damp earth, and cheap tallow wax. He unlocked the heavy, warped wooden door. The room was a miserable, freezing square of empty space. A single narrow cot pressed against a peeling water, stained well. A massive, cracked window rattled frantically against the howling gale outside, letting in a steady, biting stream of freezing air. I sat on the edge of the thin mattress. I did not pull my dark cloak tighter. My core remained at a perfect, steady zero. Down in the street, the biological shutdown of the Western Empire's sovereign monarch was reaching its terminal phase. Thorn had dragged his heavily hemorrhaging body out of the tavern. He did not walk. The catastrophic damage to his cardiac maxillary system had permanently severed the motor functions in his legs. He pulled his massive frame through the freezing mud, using only his thick, trembling arms. The heavy, iron, shod boots of his royal uniform dragged uselessly behind him, carving a deep, pathetic trench through the ice sludge. His dark, ruined velvet coat was completely saturated in the thick, black, toxic sludge, Koramkaka sludge leaking constantly from his bruised lips. He reached the exterior wall of my boarding house. He did not possess the strength to climb the rotting wooden stairs. He collapsed completely in the freezing snowbank directly beneath my second-story window. In the biology of our species, an Alpha King is not merely a political title. It is an apex biological state. His massive internal furnace, the terrifying unhinged body heat that allowed him to project dominance over thousands, required a constant, grounding tether. It required the soft, submissive frequency of his mate to regulate the burn. Without the spun honey of my omega soul to cool his blood, his own power had turned into a assuming parasite. The severed mate bond was actively shutting down his organs one by one. His body was a burning engine completely out of oil, aggressively tearing itself apart from the inside. His miraculous alpha healing factor went completely offline. The brutal sub-zero temperature of the northern blizzard began to rapidly freeze the blood in his veins. The thick, dark crimson pooling the snow in his chest crystallized into sharp, jagged ice. His lips turned a terrifying, bruised shade of violet. His dense muscle mass, entirely deprived of oxygen by his failing lung, began to violently necrotize. The harsh elements were actively invading his immortal flesh. He pressed his broad, bleeding spine flat against the freeze timber of the boarding house. He pulled his massive, useless knees tight to his chest, curling his towering frame in a tight, shivering ball in the mud. He was deliberate, stripping him of his crown. An Alpha King requires the highest elevation, the softest furs, the absolute scent of Pax warmth. But Thorn was demoting him to the rank of a feral, beaten stray. He was banishing him to the freezing dirt because his fractured mind had finally accepted a terrifying truth. He was no longer worthy of sharing my oxygen. He was a guard dog waiting outside the master quarters, perfectly willing to let the harsh elements freeze the blood in his veins if it meant he could remain within 10 feet of my shadow. He wanted the ice to punish him since he refused to. He wanted the blizzard to slowly execute him, because my absolute silence had already pronounced the sentence. The storm broke over the mountain pass at midnight. A brutal, driving sleet hammered the rotting walls of the inn. Through the thin, warped floors of my room, I could perfectly hear the agonizing rhythm of his biological failure. His breathing was so shallow it was virtually undetectable, broken only by sudden wet, rattling hitches, as his lungs desperately fought against the heavy fluid drowning them. The heavy, suffocating stench of burnt cedar ash, wet mud, and dying copper seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. It was the smell of God actively rotting in the dirt. In my past life, that scent would have sent me in a frantic weeping hysteria. I would have torn the boarding house apart to reach him, wrapping my own warm body around his freezing frame to force his heart to beat again. I would have begged the universe to take my life instead of his. I sat perfect still on the edge of the narrow cot. The sovereign void inside my chest remained completely undisturbed. I smooth-swung my worn leather boots on the mattress. I lay down, pulling the thin, moth-eaten wool blanket up over my shoulders. I stared blankly at the peeling, water-stained ceiling. The void required no dreams. It offered no phantom memories of a warm chest or a heavy cedar scent. I simply closed my eyes and existed in a perfect, undisturbed vacuum. The psychic static of the world was beautifully, permanently muted. Outside, the violent shivering racking his massive frame suddenly stopped. The cessation of movement was not a sign of recovery. It was the terrifying, terminal calm that precedes complete cellular death. His core temperature had dropped so low that his brain could no longer send the electrical signals required to make Usacal's contract. He was freezing solid. The sleet was actively fusing his ruined velvet coat to the muddy earth. But then a horrific rhythmic sound began to echo from the snow alley beneath my window. It was not a gasp for air, a deliberate, agonizing scrape, a heavy, bone-deep grinding noise. I opened my eyes and listened to the exact cadence of sound cutting through the howling wind. Thorn was not dying peacefully in the snow. He was using his thick, frost-bitten fingernails to physically gouge something deep in the freezing, rotting timber of the boarding house exterior wall. The sickening sound of his fingernails, tearing completely off the nail beds, echoed violently through the silent night. The pale, sickly gray light of morning crept through the cracked dirt, stained window pane. I opened my eyes. My body was completely rigid and had turned untouched by bitter cold that had turned the wash basin water into a solid block of ice. I did not stretch. I did not shiver beneath the thin, moth-eaten sat up and swung my legs over the edge of the narrow cot. I pulled my worn leather boots onto my feet, lacing them with slow, methodical precision. The sovereign void in my body hummed with a quiet, undisturbed static. I picked up my canvas bag, stepped out of the freezing room, and walked down the rotting wooden stairs. The boarding house lobby was completely deserted, smelling heavily of stale pipe smoke and frozen dampness. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out onto the street. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a treacherous, blindingly bright landscape of jagged black ice and freezing slush. I looked down at the exterior timber wall of the inn. The horrific, rhythmic scraping I had heard during the night was immediately explained. Thorn had not been carving a message. He had been desperately, frantically packing wet mud, dead pine needles, and his own freezing blood in the deep structural cracks of the foundation. He had torn his fingernails completely off his thick hands, just to seal the drafts beneath my floorboards. He had spent his final ounces of biological energy trying to insulate my room from the outside elements. He was slumped against the sealed timber, a colossal, pathetic heap of frost-covered velvet and necrotizing flesh. The heavy sleet had frozen his dark hair to his skull. His skin was a terrifying, translucent shade of gray. I stepped off the wooden porch. My right boot landed heavily in a deep puddle of half-frozen sludge. A thick splash of freezing mud splattered across the worn leather, seeping slightly into the fraying seams near my toe. The microscopic sound of the splashing mud violently resurrected him. A harsh, rattling gasp tore through his ruined throat. The thick layer of ice coating his broad shoulders cracked sharply as his massive body violently jerked. He did not lift head to look at my face. His bloodshot, sunken amber sock snapped open, lock intently, obsessively, on the dark smear of mud on my right shoe. The suffocating stench of rotting copper and burnt ash flared weakly in the freezing air, a dying engine trying to spark. He dragged his heavy, paralyzed lower half forward, using his ruined, bleeding hands. He did not speak my name. He did not beg for his Luna to return. He completely ignored the agonizing, terminal failure of his own cardiovascular system. He reached my feet, filthy hem of his midnight velvet coat. With manic, trembling desperation, he pressed the heavy fabric against the toe of my boot. The mud will seep through. His voice was a hollow, echoing rasp, barely louder than the crunch of the ice. He scrubbed the leather frantically, his ruined, nail-less fingers leaving faint, bloody smears against the dark hide. The seams are completely bare. The water will reach your socks. Your toes will freeze. You cannot walk in the snow with these. The leather is rotting. I will skin the leviathan wolves of the northern spine. I will tan the hides mice. I will make you boots that never let the cold in. You are getting wet. You are getting so incredibly wet. It was psychotic, deeply tragic subtext. The Alpha King was bleeding to death in the dirt, his internal organs actually liquefying from rejection sickness, and his entire fractured universe, my shoe, was reduced to the dampness of my shoe. He was trying to assert his biological role as the Grand Protector by frantically cleaning a puddle of mud off cheap leather. He believed that if he could just keep my feet perfectly dry, the horrific, apocalyptic reality of my dead soul might somehow reverse itself. A violent wet cough suddenly seized his chest. He turned his head sharply, desperate to aim away from my feet, and vomited a thick, dark stream of necrotic blood directly in the white snow beside my heel. The hot, metallic stench of his rotting, keyed frame's morning air, his massive frame shuddered violently with the force of the massive hemorrhage. He did not clutch his chest. He did not gasp for a healer. The exact second the coughing fit subsided, he violently wiped his bruised, blood-stained lips with the back of his wrist and immediately returned to scrubbing my boot. He rubbed the velvet aggressively over the leather, panting heavily, terrifyingly hyper-focus on the microscopic speck of dirt. I am sorry. The mud is so thick here. I will get it out. I swear on the bloodline, I will get it out. I stood perfectly still. I did not pull my foot back to spare him the indignity. I did not tell him to stop. I simply watched the invincible god of the Western Valley reduce him to a feral, trembling servant. I felt absolute nothing. The deep permafrost in my chest absorbed his pathetic, bleeding grovel without a single ripple. My biological indifference was absolute. He scrubbed the leather until it was entirely spotless, save for the dark, sticky residue of his own ruined fingers. He slumped forward, his cheek flushed as the freezing mud mere inches from my toe, his breathing an erratic, bubbling wheeze. Then the heavy, grating sound of the indoor opening broke the silence. The heavily scarred innkeeper stepped on Cecilia porch. He held a steaming ceramic mug of hot tea in his thick, unwashed hands. He looked down at the bleeding monarch in the dirt, then up at my completely unreadable face. That tea cost 2 silver pieces. The innkeeper's voice was laced with the arrogant cruelty of the lawless zone. He held the steaming mug out, making no move to bring it closer. Thorn's head snapped up from the freezing mud, the dying, pathetic ember in his bloodshot, alleged light, terrifying. The innkeeper stood on the rotting porch, the steaming mug held out like a taunt, 2 silver pieces for boiled dirty water and bitter leaves. I did not carry coin. I had walked out of the grand estate with nothing but the wool on my back. I simply looked at the innkeeper, my face an unreadable mask of sterile calm, fully prepared to turn my back and walk out of the logging town with a single drop of warmth. I did not need the tea. My core temperature was permanently fixed in a state of deep winter. But the sound of the innkeeper's demand had violently activated a dormant primal circuit deep within the ruined biology of the Alpha King. Thorn dragged his massive, paralyzed frame away from the toe of my boot. His chest heaved with a sudden manic energy. The primal instinct of an alpha to provide sustenance for his omega was a fundamental, unyielding law of nature, but he possessed no silver. He was a fugit king, drowned in his own necrotic blood in a neutral zone, stripped entirely of his royal treasury. He lifted his heavy, trembling right hand. On his index finger rested the ancestral signet ring of the Western Empire. It was a massive, terrifying piece of jewelry forged from solid, unalloyed mountain gold and inset with a colossal, flawless blood ruby. The crest of his ancient's bloodline was carved deep in the gemstone. It was the absolute symbol of his sovereign authority. For centuries, that ring had sealed treaties, ordered massacres, and demanded the absolute submission of thousands. It was the exact ring that had stamped the wax on the patrol orders, sending me to my death in my past life. Thorn stared at the ring. His bloodshot amber eyes did not hold a single ounce of reverence for his ancestors. He did not see a priceless artifact. He did not see the sacred weight of his dynasty. He saw a barrier to my tea. He gripped the thick gold band with his bloody, nailless fingers and violently wrenched it off his hand. The metal scraped against his swollen knuckle, tearing the skin, but he did not even flinch. He did not hand the ring to the innkeeper. A neutral drifter could not hold the royal crest, a desecration of the biological war, desecration of the biological hierarchy. Thorn did not care about the hierarchy. He only cared about the transaction. He placed the priceless gold ring on the bottom wooden step of the porch. He reached in the freezing slush with his left hand and pulled free a heavy, jagged piece of black granite. He raised the heavy stone high above his head. He brought it down with a sickening, violent crash. The sound of the stone striking the solid gold, like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. The innkeeper flinched, stepping backward in sudden terror. Thorn brought the stone down again. And again, the rhythmic, brutal smashing sent shards of ice and splintered wood flying across my leather boots. He was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, pouring the absolute last muscopic reserves of his physical strength in destroying his own legacy. The flawless blood ruby shattered into 1,000 jagged red fragments. The solid mountain gold buckled, warping and flattening under relentless, unhinged assault. The ancient crest of the dominant wolf was completely pulverized, ground down into unrecognizable raw metal and red dust. He threw the jagged granite aside. His massive chest hitched violently as he scraped the mangled, ruined fortune in his bleeding palm. He dragged his heavy body up the first rotting step. He reached up and forcefully shoved the handful of crushed gold and shattered ruby in the innkeeper's free hand. The innkeeper stared at the literal fortune resting in his dirty palm, his eyes wide with absolute breathless shock. The raw gold alone was worth enough to buy the entire logging town 3 times over. Thorn didn't wait for a reaction. His trembling, bloody fingers snatched the ceramic mug of hot tea. He turned his massive frame back toward me. He did not stand. He remained kneeling on the rotting steps, offering the mug upward like a desperate servant presenting a holy relic. The steam is rising. His voice was a raw, wet scrape. He stared obsessively at the curling white vapor rising from the hot water. His thick fingers were wrapped around the cheap ceramic, the heat actively burning the raw, exposed nerves where your nails used to be. But he held the mug perfectly steady. The water is hot. The leaves will warm your throat. You have to drink it while the steam is still rising. Do not let the cold air touch the water. The wind will ruin it. Please take it before the wind ruins the heat. I smashed the wolf. The wolf is now. It is just gold now. It is just metal. Please drink the heat. He was completely, entirely broken. The Alpha King had physically pulverized symbolism, suffocating dominance, just to buy a momentary distraction from the freeze wind. He was offering the ultimate, bloody subtext. He was screaming that he would destroy his own empire, his own history, and his own identity just to keep my hands warm for 5 minutes. I looked down at the steaming mug. I looked at the dark, toxic blood steadily dripping from his chin in the freezing slush between us. The sovereign void in my chest did not thaw. The absolute permafrost did not recognize the sacrifice. I simply extended my pale, completely steady hand and took the ceramic mug from his ruined fingers. Our skin did touch. The sheer blinding relief that washed over his bloodshot eyes was apocalyptic. He let a long, shuddering exhale, a wet, rattling sound of pure salvation. He watched me take a slow, unbothered sip of the bitter root water. He finally paid a muskakak fraction of the toll. But as the weak morning sun fully crested the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the snow street, he did not ask to come inside the warm boarding house. He dragged his heavy, paralyzed body backward, moving away from the porch, dragging him slowly toward the deepest, darkest snow drift directly beneath my window. I took the hot tea back up the rotting stairs. The ceramic was warm against my pale fingers, radiating a death-violent heat that Thorn had literally pulverized his own legacy to procure. But the warmth did not penetrate my skin. The thick, impenetrable permafrost resting deep within my chest remained a flawless, undisturbed zero. I stepped in the freezing, empty room and walked directly toward the massive, cracked window pane. I looked down in the alley. The blizzard had left a massive, towering snowdrift direct beneath the structural overhang of my room. It was a brutal, deep trench of compacted ice and freezing slush. The town's stray hounds were actively avoiding it, their primal instincts warning them of the lethal tipper. Thorn was not avoiding it. He was actively burying himself inside it. He had dragged his heavy, paralyzed lower half in the absolute center of the drift. Using his ruined, nailless fingers, he was frantically, obsessively digging a shallow trench in the freezing white powder. He was not trying to build a shelter. He was hollowing out a guard post. He was a feral, beaten stray dog, aggressively tense beneath his master's window. The biological degradation of his immortal flesh was actively accelerating. An alpha king is genetically designed to exist at the absolute epicenter of a pack's territorial heat. They require the heavy, insulated layers of omega submission and beta loyalty to regulate their massive internal furnaces. By banishing him to the deepest, coldest snowbank in a neutral zone, completely starved of my biological frequency, Thorn was willing subjecting him to a brutal, agonizing execution. The dark, toxic flood of his necrotic blood leaked steadily from his bruised lips, staining the pristine white snow around his chin in a horrific, expanding halo. The blood did not melt the snow. It froze instantly, creating a jagged black crown of ice around his thick neck. His mint-velvet coat was frozen completely solid, acting as a heavy cage rather than a layer of warmth. The intricate silver embroidery of the royal crest on his broad shoulder was entirely obscured by a thick layer of filthy mud. He positioned his shivering shoulders perfectly against the prevailing northern wind. He was actively using his own dying, bleeding body as a fixed foundation of the boarding house for the rotting timber Yaros. The glass will not rattle. The timber is rotting, but I am strong. I am heavier than the storm. His voice was a hollow, breathless whisper, completely swallowed by the howling gale. He was not talking to me. He was speaking frantically to the freezing dirt, his golden eyes blown wide with a manic, terrifying delusion. The wind is coming from the spine. It hits the baseboards. It travels up the timber and rattles the glass panes. The rattling will keep her awake. She needs the silent, the void. I will swallow the wind. I will freeze the air in my own lungs before it touches the wood. The glass will stay perfectly still. He violently shoved another handful of packed ice directly against his own bleeding, mangled chest, seeing the microscopic gap between his body and the building. He was actively burying his heart in the permafrost, attempting to mimic the absolute zero of my soul to prove he understood the new law of our existence. He believed his physical suffering was a direct down payment on my undisturbed sleep. I stood at the window, the steaming mug in my hand. I watched the invincible god of the western continent willing freeze to death in the dirt. I felt absolutely nothing. In my past life, the sight of a single scratch on his broad chest would have sent a hysterical, suffocating wave of spun honey and sweet almond flooding through my veins. I would drop the tea. I would run screaming down the stairs, throw my warm, fragile body over his massive frame, begging the universe to spare my king. The sovereign void processed the visual data of his dying body with the clinical empty tap of glacier watching a leaf falls. The ledger was simply balancing. In my forgotten timeline, he had orchestrated an entire massacre just to play the hero, using my terror as a mirror for his own vanity. He had pinned me to the freezing ground with his alpha command and let the rogues tear my throat out. Now he was pinning him to the freezing ground, entirely paralyzed by my absolute silence, to tear him apart to feed my apathy. I did not owe him the warmth of my I did not owe him the warmth of my gaze. I did not owe him the sweet scent of forgiveness. I raised the ceramic mug to my lips. I took another slow, unhurried sip. The bitter root water washed over my tongue, completely devoid of flavor. Outside, the pale winter sun completely vanished behind the heavy, jagged peaks of the northern mountain range. The ambient temperature in the valley instantly plummeted. Hobby. The rapid drop in barometric pressure triggered the final, catastrophic stage of his rejection sickness. The violent, manic shivering that had racked his massive frame suddenly ceased entirely. His broad chest hitched in a terrifying, suspended paralysis. The suffocating stench of his burnt cedar and rotting copper instant flatlined in the frigid air. He let out a long, wet, bubbling wheeze that rattled the ice window pane directly in front of my face. It was the horrific, mechanical sound of heavy fluid permanently filling the lower lobes of his lungs. He was drowning on dry land. The feral guard dog had finally reached the absolute limit of his biological endurance. His heavy eyelids fluttered shut, and his chin dropped full against his chest as the deep, terminal sleep of the freezing void began to pull him completely under. The darkness of the room was absolute. The howling wind outside had settled in a low, mournful drone, leaving a heavy, suffocating stillness in its wake. Through the thin floorboards, the agonizing, wet rattle of Thorne's failing lungs had completely ceased. He was no longer fighting the ice. He had surrendered to the terminal freeze, his immortal biology finally buckling under the colossal weight of my indifference. I stood up from the narrow cot. I unlatched the heavy iron buckles of my canvas travel bag. I reached inside and pulled out the thickest, heaviest woolen blanket I possessed. It was a crude, tightly woven piece of rough sheepskin, entirely devoid of the luxurious silk or spun gold of the pack house. I draped the heavy wool over my arm. I walked down the dark, creaking wooden stairs, my worn leather boots making no sound against the rotting timber. I pushed the front door open. The night air was a solid wall of sub-zero agony. The alleyway was a graveyard of black ice and towering snowdrifts. Thorne was a terrifying frozen monument in the center of the sludge. His broad shoulders were completely encased in a thick, jagged shell of solid ice. His head hung limply against his massive chest, his dark slicked hair frozen entirely to his collarbone. The toxic black blood around his mouth had crystallized into dark, jagged glass. His chest was perfectly, completely still. He was, by every biological metric of our species, seconds away from absolute death. I stepped off the porch. My boots crunched softly against the packed snow. I stopped exactly 2 feet from his buried, massive frame. I did not kneel. I did not reach out to press 2 fingers against his freezing pulse point. I simply unrolled the heavy woolen blanket from my arm. I let the fabric drop. The heavy wool fell through the freezing air and landed squarely over his ice-covered arms, draping over his frozen neck and chest like a coarse, dark shroud. The microscopic shift in weight and temperature was a violent, apocalyptic defibrillator to his deadened nervous system. A sudden, horrific crack echoed through the alley as the thick ice encasing his chest physically shattered. A violent, ragged gasp ripped through his ruined throat. His massive body jerked upward, his heavy spine snapping straight. His bloodshot, sunken amber eyes flew open. He stared at the thick wool blanket resting on his shoulders. He stared at the pale, steady hands resting quietly at my sides. The biological response was tense and catastrophic. A massive, blinding surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline violently restarted his failing heart. The heavy, sluggish sludge in his veins instant liquefied, rushing through his necrotizing tissue with the force of a tidal wave. The false hope was a blinding, intoxicating narcotic. You came outside. His voice was a desperate, wet, euphoric rasp. His massive chest began to heave with rapid, panicked breaths. He reached up with his ruined, bloody fingers, clutching the edges of the rough wool with a manic, terrifying reverence. He did not feel the freezing cold. He did not feel the agonizing pain of his ruptured internal organs. He only felt the literal weight of my gesture. You brought me wool. He pressed his freezing, bruised face directly in the rough fabric. His golden eyes dilated until they were almost entirely black, wet with hot, desperate tears of absolute salvation. His fractured mind constructed a grand, beautiful delusion. He believed the blanket was the first, microscopic thaw of my permafrost. He believed the sterile, unbothered motion of dropping the fabric was an act of profound, protective omega love. "You are freezing your hands. You can't be out here in the snow. Go back to bed. I will wrap this around my chest. I will heat the fabric with my own blood. I will keep the draft away." You looked at me. You saw the ice and you brought me the wool. You are so warm. You are so perfectly, beautifully warm. His massive, trembling body leaned forward, desperate to close the final 2 feet between us. He was a starving beast staring directly at an oasis, his entire soul radiating a blinding, desperate belief that he had finally breached my walls. He waited for my smile. He was waiting for the thaw. His golden eyes were wide, liquid, and burning with a frantic, euphoric heat. The heavy, rotting scent of his terminal decline had briefly hitched, desperately attempting to ignite the rich, dominant cedar of a king, who believed his queen was finally returning to her throne. His ruined, nailless finger gripped the cheap wool as if it were the sacred, glowing silver thread of the mate bond itself. He breathed the rough fabric in deeply, his massive chest expanding, starving for the warm, submissive rush of sweet almond and spun honey he believed I had woven into threads. He found absolutely nothing. The wool smelled only of stale dust, dead sheepskin, and the freezing, sterile air of my rented room. I looked down at his bruised, violently hopeful face. I did not soften my posture. I did not tilt my head in a display of tragic mercy. The sovereign void in my chest processed his blinding salvation with the cold, mechanical indifference of a ticking clock. The freezing slush seeped lightly in the fraying seams of my leather boots, but I did not shift my weight. I simply let the absolute silence stretch between us for a fraction of a second before I delivered the execution. My voice was a flat, unhurried metronome, cutting cleanly through the howling northern wind. Your shivering is vibrating against the structural timber. Thorn froze. The manic, desperate smile on his bruised lips violently halted. His breath caught sharply in his ruined throat. The impact of your spine against the foundation is traveling up the baseboards. It is rattling the floor joyous directly beneath my cot. The sound is incredibly repetitive. It is keeping me awake. Stared into his blown and out pupils with the clinical detachment of a mortician adjusting a corpse. I need you to muffle the shivering. If you can't stop your body from failing, bite down on the wool. Do not let your teeth chatter against the wood. I require silence to sleep. The quiet that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was the apocalyptic, terrifying vacuum of a human soul completely, irreversibly detonating. The microscopic spark of dominant cedar instantly, violently died. The scent of his royal aura did not just sour, it evaporated entirely into heavy, suffocating stench of terminal despair, rotting copper and cold, dead ash. It was the smell of man realizing that his physical suffering possessed absolutely zero currency in my kingdom. His golden eyes, moments ago alight with the blinding salvation of my supposed mercy, shattered into a million hollow, dead fragments. His fractured brain finally processed the sheer, absolute brutality of the subtext. I had not stepped out in the freezing blizzards to save his life. I had not draped the blanket over his bleeding shoulders to warm his dying heart. I had stepped out to silence a nuisance. He was not a fallen king receiving the merciful grace of his Luna. He was a feral rat scratching inside the walls of my peace, and I had simply tossed a rag over the hole to muffle the noise of his death. His massive, broad shoulders violently collapsed inward, physically caving under the crushing of his pressure of his total spiritual ruin. The heavy woolen blanket slipped slightly, pooling around his frozen, necrotizing chest. He did not let out a roaring, tragic howl of heartbreak. He did not reach frantically for the hem of my cloak. His jaw clamped shut with a sickening, audible click. He grabbed the thick edge of the rough wool with his bleeding hands. He shoved the fabric violently between his bruised, violet lips and bit down with enough force to shatter his own molars. He pressed his face directly into the freezing mud, actively burying his head in his massive, trembling arms to completely smother the sound of his own agonizing, drowning breaths. I walked steadily up the rotting wooden stairs, leave him entirely alone in his self-made. But as my hand touched the rusted iron latch of the inn door, a sudden piercing howl tore through the distant timberline, a chaotic that possessed absolute royal blood, only pure, feral starvation. The rusted iron latch of the inn door was freezing beneath my pale fingers. I did not push the heavy wood open. The piercing, chaotic howl that ripped through northern timberline was not the calculated Fjauertals Monarcharis. It was a jagged, unhinged frequency of pure, biological starvation. It was the sound of true rogues. The atmospheric pressure in the logging town instant collapsed into raw, visceral terror. The scent hit the bitter wind a fraction of a second later, a thick, nauseating cloud of wet, rotting fur, sour blood, and absolute feral madness. These were not mercenary paid in gold to frighten an Omega into her alpha's arms. These were massive, starving beasts driven completely insane by the sub-zero winter, descending upon the neutral zone to slaughter anything with a pulse. Screams erupted from the human settlements down the road. The heavy crashing of splintering wood and shattering glass echoed violently through the valley. The drifters and loggers were completely defenseless against apex predators. I stood perfect still on the rotting wooden porch. My heart rate did not spike. To beg for an alpha's protective shadow would permanently calcify my chest. More port deep with my chest. Possessant. My sovereign void was an absolute, flawless shield. To the highly sensitive olfactory radar of a starving rogue, I did not register as prey. I did not register as a living organism. I was completely invisible, masked perfectly by the scent of dead pine needles and frozen dirt. I could simply turn the latch, walk into my room, and sleep through the massa completely untouched. I slow-turned my head, my eyes tracking back to the massive snowdrift directly beneath my window. The heavy mound of packed ice violently shuddered. The thick woolen blanket I had dropped over him slipped, falling in the freezing. Thorn was actively dying. His cardiovascular system was a catastrophic ruin, his dense muscle tissue was aggressively necrotizing, and his mind had just been completely annihilated by my brutal erection. He was a broken feral guard dog bleeding out in the dirt. But the chaotic feral howl of approaching threat bypassed his shattered soul and slammed directly into his deepest, most ancient genetic hardwiring. He was still the Alpha King, and there were teeth moving toward his Luna. A horrific, wet tearing sound echoed through the alley as Thorn forcefully ripped his frozen back away from structural timber. The ice encasing his broad shoulders shattered. He did not possess the motor function in his legs to walk. He did not possess the lung capacity to project a dominant, gravity-inducing roar. He dragged his massive lower half through the deep snow, using only the sheer unadulterated violence of his thick arms. He pulled his ruined body out of the snowbank and threw his massive, bleeding frame directly on the bottom step of the porch. He physically barricaded the narrow wooden staircase lead up to my boots. 3 massive feral rogues rounded the corner of the alley. They were tower nightmares of matted dark fur and exposed, snapping jaws. Their pale, starving eyes locked instantly on the massive, bleeding monarch, blocking their path. They did not bow. They did not whimper in submission. They smelled the toxic, necrotic sludge of his rotting internal organs. They smelled a dying, weakened king completely devoid of his territorial aura. They smelled an easy, colossal meal. The lead rogue let out a deep, guttural snarl, his heavy paws gouging deep tracks in the black ice as he prepared to launch massive forward. In my past life, this was the exact moment Thorn would have shifted. This was the moment his bones would have violently snapped and reformed into towering, invincible beast of midnight fur. He would have torn the rogues to pieces, painting the snow red to prove his absolute, terrifying dominion over the earth. Thorn did not shift. He remained in his broken, battered human form. He'd knelt on the bottom wooden step, his midnight velvet coat heavily soaked in black blood and freezing mud. He breathed in short, frantic, agonizing gasps, his broad chest hitching erratically. He slowly turned his head, sunk at me, amber eyes looked up, stand on the porch. He did not on the porch. He had teed a 3 massive beasts preparing to tear his throat out. He looked exclusively at the cold, unreadable glass of my eyes. He lifted his heavy, ruined hands, but he did not raise them to brace for the impact. He reached up, grabbed the torn, bloody collar of his own linen shirt, and violently ripped fabric downward, pulled the thick, vulnerable flesh of his jugular vein to the freezing wind. The lead rogue launched its massive, starving body through the freezing air. It did not hit a defensive wall of alpha muscle. It slammed directly into willing martyr. The beast's massive jaws clamped brutally onto Thorn's exposed left shoulder. It was the exact anatomical trajectory of the fatally my first life. The sickening, wet crunch of thick canine teeth, easily shattering his collarbone, echoed sharply against the rotting timber of the inn. Thorn did not roar in agony. He did not raise his heavy, scarred fists to shatter the rogue's skull. He let a long, wet gasp of pure, absolute relief. The impact threw his massive frame backward on the icy steps, but he actively wrapped his uninjured right arm around the rogue's matted, filthy torso. He was not grappling for leverage to break the beast's neck. He was pulling the feral monster closer. He physically yanked the starving animal deeper in his own ruined flesh, actively burying the snapping jaws in the dense muscle of his throat. "Take it." His voice was an ecstatic, bubbling wheeze, completely muffled by the wet fur and the horrific tearing of his own meat. "Take the vein, tear the arrogance out. It has to be symmetrical. You have to make the snow completely red. She needs the ledger balance. Bite deeper. You are not biting deep enough for her." The two remaining rogues descended upon his paralyzed lower half. Their heavy teeth tore frantically in the ruined veld of his coat, shredding his dense leg muscles and snapping the thick bones of his shins. The air was instant, suffocated by hot, metallic stench of arterial blood spray across the black ice. The pristine white snowbanks of the alley rapidly melted under the sheer volume of his terminal hemorrhage, turning the frozen street into steaming, gruesome swamp. He was being eaten alive in the dirt. The invincible apex predator of the Western continent was joyfully offering him as a slaughtered calf to a pack of starving strays. He believed his physical destruction was the only currency left in the universe that could purchase my forgiveness. If he could not warm my hands with a blanket, he would paint the entire logging town with his own vital fluids just to prove his devotion. I stood perfectly still on the rotting wooden porch. I was entirely undisturbed by the apocalyptic violence erupting exactly 3 feet from my boots. My heart maintained a flawless, slow rhythm. The sovereign void processed the horrific tearing of his flesh with the sterile, empty boredom of a winter glacier. The warm, thrown desperer body into the snapping jaws to save him was a permanently calcified fossil. I simply watched him pay his bloody, pathetic penance. He did not look at the beast in him apart. His bloodshot, rapidly dipping amber remained obsessively terrifying licks on the hem of my dark cloak. A thick, hot spray of dark crimson splattered across the worn leather of my left boot. Thorn's massive chest hitched violently in pure panic. He completely ignored the rogue actively chewing through his collarbone. He frantically reached his bloody, nailless hand toward my foot, desperate to wipe the stain away before it seeped into the seams. "I am sorry. I am let it splash." His dying words were absolute lunacy. He was aggressively apologizing for the trajectory of his own fatal arterial spray. Then, the frozen beneath the alley violently trembled. It was not the erratic height of a dying king. It was the synchronized, thunderous march of 50 heavily armored predators, moving at a dead sprint. The royal vanguard had finally tracked the dead zone to the neutral town. 50 executioners crashed in the alleyway, their heavy, broad-drawn and gleaming under the pale morning light. The towering commander at the front of the phalanx let out a world-ending, blood-curdling roar of primal fury as he witnessed his sovereign monarch being torn apart in the mud. He raised his massive blade, surging forward to instantly decapitate the feral beasts. "Stop." Thorn did not shout. He possessed no lung capacity left. The command was a weak, dying psych pulse, fueled by the absolute, terrified peak of his biological panic. "Do not touch them." The vanguard froze completely in their tracks. The psychic command was entirely stripped of alpha dominance, but it carried the is suicidal Zephyrus seeing his final termini decree. Madin. The 50 massive warriors slid to a halt on the black ice, their broadswords trembling violently in the air. Their highly sensitive olfactory nerves slammed into the suffocating stench of their alpha willing surrendering his life. They were biologically paralyzed, forced to stand and watch in absolute, breathless horror as the rogues continued to aggressively devour their invincible god. Thorn slowly dragged his chin up from the freezing slush. He looked past the feral jaws tearing his shoulder apart, past the 50 horrified witnesses of his empire, and locked his dying eye directly onto my hollow, dead stare. He reached his bloody, trembling hand up to his own neck, his thick fingers fumbling blindly against the shredded collar of his shirt. The three feral beasts abruptly stopped tearing at his flesh. The sheer, overwhelming atmospheric pressure of heavy armor, vanguard executioners, flooding the narrow alleyway, finally pierced through their starving delirium. Self-preservation violently overrode their blind hunger. They released Thorn's mangled shoulder, their blood-soaked muzzles seething air, and scrambled back westwards. They turned and vanished in the dense, dark timberline like terrified shadows. Thorn did not issue a command to hunt them down. He let them leave. The ledger required their teeth. Man Vance stood frozen at the bay at the rotting porch. He was a colossal battle, scarred beta, man conditioned to charge blindly into suicidal warfare at a single roar from his king. But his heavy iron broadsword hung loosely from his grip, the tip dragging uselessly against the black ice. Behind him, the 49 elite warriors of the royal phalanx mirrored his absolute breathless paralysis. They were not staring at the horrific, fatal wounds actively draining the life from their sovereign monarch. They were staring at me. Their highly advanced olfactory receptors frantically swept the freezing morning air, desperately searching for the rich, comforty, spun honey and sweet almond of their Luna. They searched for the biological frequency that would explain why the invincible Alpha King they found hips to feral strays. They hit the impenetrable wall of my sovereign void, to the primal, instinctual hardwiring of the 50 most lethal predators on the continent. Thorn was not bowing to a queen. He was desperately, frantically worshipping a localized pocket of dead air. The sheer cognitive dissonance of witnessing a god sacrifice for a ghost completely short-circuited their military discipline. Thorn let out a ragged, bubbling wheeze. He ignored his horrified army entirely. His bloody, trembling fingers spun antically digging for beneath the shredded collar of his shirt. It was the Alphad Adal seal. A heavy, ancient medallion forged from unalloyed mountain silver, suspended on a thick chain. It was the sacred biological epicenter of the Western Empire. For over 6 centuries, that heavy piece of silver had served as the psychic anchor for thousands of wolves, the physical manifestation of absolute, unquestionable patriarchal dominance. He gripped the thick silver chain. He did not delicately unhook the clasp. He violently yanked his bloody fist downward. The ancient metal snapped with a sharp, horrific crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent alley. He did not turn and hand the sacred artifacts Ardos to Commander Vance to secure the line of succession. He dragged his ruined, hemorrhaging chest up the finals, leaving a thick, steaming trail of dark blood across the rotting timber. He reached the toe of my worn leather boot. With trembling, agonizing reverence, he placed the heavy blood-soaked silver seal directly beneath the sole of my shoe. The silver is too heavy. His voice was a wet, hollow scrape, barely audible over the howling northern wind, yet it carried the terrifying, absolute finality of a terminal decree. It dragged your neck down, it buzzed in your skull and kept you awake. I am turn the noise off. I am breaking frequency. Please, step on the metal. Crush the wolves. You do not have to listen to us ever again. He was publicly willing to execute his own empire. The Alpha King was beg his silent, indifferent mate to physically shatter the biological hierarchy of their entire species simply because he believed the Psych-Humma Pack link had given her a headache. He was trading the absolute loyalty of thousands for that my silent might slight more comfortables. Solace. Us. Commander Vance let a raw choke gasp. The towering beta dropped violently to knees in the freezing slush, his mass shoulders shaking as he quit up ballistic destruction his bloodline had squatched her one, Nesraswa protect. Behind him, in a wave of crushing, synchronized despair, 49 elite executioners crashed to their knees. The heavy thud of their iron armor hitting the ice shook the earth. They were mourning a king who was still breathing. Thorn slowly dragged his bruised, freezing face forward until his forehead rested gently against the splintered wood right next to my heel. He did not ask for my hands to heal him. He did not ask for the spun honey to return. He simply offered his final, ragged breaths as a tribute to the cold, empty void he had forced me to become. I looked down at the ruined, bloody god resting at my feet, the voice in my chest returned flawless, undisturbed permafrost. I did not shift my weight. I did not crush the silver seal, nor did I kick it away. I simply observed the mathematic perfection of the moment. The ledger was finally, entirely balanced. Then the idiotic, frantic hitching of his massive chest completely stopped. The toxic, heavy stench of rotting copper and burnt ash vanished from the winter air, replaced instantly by the sterile, absolute stillness of the frozen grave. His bloodshot amber eyes rolled back, and the heavy, invincible rhythm of the Alpha King's heart completely ceased to beat. The absolute silence, the neutral alleyway, was profound. It was a flawless, undisturbed mirror of the permafrost resting heavily inside my own chest. Thorn was dead. His towering, immortal biology had finally surrendered to the apocalyptic weight of my indifference. The suffocating stench of his actively rotting soul evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the clay dust, pine, frozen mud. Behind his colossal corpse, the 50 massive executioners of the royal vanguard remained kingly, still on their knees in the freezing slush. They did not scream. They did not surge forward to draw their broadswords and slaughter the Omega, who had just executed their invincible god through sheer apathy. The psychic shockwave of his death had violently severed their pack link, not seeing the invisible tether in their minds, and leaving Grow in the sea-morn air. They stared at the bloody snow, completely broken, silently waiting for a command from a king who no longer existed. I lay down at his bruised, lifeless face resting on the rotting timber at my boots. The violent manic terror that had haunted his blown-out amber eyes for 2 days was entirely gone, replaced by the smooth, empty peace of the void. He had paid the toll in full. He had violently slaughtered his own toxic ego, physically pulverized the priceless symbol of his royal legacy, and willing fed his own throat to starving beasts just to keep the wind from ratting my window pane. The bloody ledger of my past life was finally balanced. Permanently. The warm, frantic girl made of spun honey and sweet almond would have thrown herself on his bleeding chest, weeping the universe to rollably, begging the universe to reverse time. She would have gladly offered her own throat to the rogues to spare him a single moment of pain. The girl made of ice simply processed the raw, clinical data of the moment. An empire stripped entirely of its takes predator was a chaotic, vulnerable liability. It would invite endless border wars and rogue invasions. But a feral guard dog, thoroughly broken, stripped of all arrogance, and permanently leashed to the absolute silence of my will, was a profound biological utility. I slowly shifted my weight. The worn leather of my boots creaked softly against the splintered wood. I lowered my knees pressing firmly into the freezing, blood-soaked timber of the porch. I did not move with frantic, trembly desperation. I moved with the slow, terrifying, unbothered precision of an executioner deciding to issue a pardon. My pale, complete steady hands hovered over his ruined, mangled shoulder. I pressed my bare palms directly against the shredded, violently exposed flesh of his jugular vein. The biological reaction was instantaneous, but it was not the warm, glowing rush of traditional Omega healing. There was no sweet scent of blooming flowers returning to the air. There was no soft golden, radiating heat weaving his dense muscle fibers back together. It was the sheer apocalyptic thermal shock of absolute zero. My touch acted as a biological defibrillator forged from solid glacis. The thick, impenetrable permafrost residing in my chest aggressively flooded into his deadened vascular system. I did not offer him warmth to restart his heart. I violently lowered his internal temperature until it perfectly matched my own. The deep, jagged tears in his throat did not slowly stitch together under warm glow. They aggressively snapped, froze. The dark, necrotic blood pooling in his ruined chest instant crystallized, effectively cauterized the massive, fatal hemorrhages with microscopic shards ice. The ruined veld of his coat physically stiffened, binding his shattered collarbone in place with the sheer force of the cold. I was forcing my sovereign void directly in his veins. Deep within the pitch-black emptiness of my calcified soul, a new mechanism suddenly sparked to life. It was not a resurrection of the Omega. It was a profound, terrifying evolutionary adaptation. The ancient, suffocating golden tether that had once chained my spine to his dominant gravity was permanent dead. In its place, a single microscopic thread began to silently weave itself into existence. It was not forged from warmth, submission, or chaotic emotional demands. It was a flawless razor, thin filament of pure spun silver. It was completely cold, carried andesite weight. It demanded no obedience. It simply existed, an unbreakable, chillingly equal connection extending from the absolute zero of my chest directly in the dead, heavy muscle of his frozen heart. I pushed the silver thread deep into his cardiac tissue. A sudden, violent crack echoed through his ribcage. Thorn's massive spine snapped rigidly against the wooden steps. A horrific, tearing gasp pulling the winter air deeply into his chest with the desperate, frantic velocity of a drowning man breaching the surface. His broad chest heaved, his heart violently slammed back into existence, but it not to beat with the arrogant, thunny tempo of Andorus Humperas Soad Preteritsesipar, projecting his dominion. It beat with a slow, heavy, subservient thud. It perfectly matched the unhurried metronome of my own pulse. His heavy eyelids fluttered, violently cracking the thin layer of frost that had formed over his eyelashes. His sunken, amber eyes stared blindly in the pale morning light. He was biologically alive, but the colossal, terrified gravity of the Alpha King had not returned with him. He let out a long, shuddering exhale, a thick mist of frozen breath curling around my pale wrist. He felt the absolute cold of the silver thread anchor permanently into his soul. His massive, blood-soaked hand twitched in the slush, thick, farts dragging of my cloud, blinds his searching for the hem of my cloak. The heavy blood-soaked fingers of the former Alpha King finally found the fraying dark wool of my winter cloak. He did not grip the fabric with the demanding, possessive iron fist of a sovereign monarch claiming his property. He pinched the cheap, frozen material with the terrifying, breathless reverence of a dying man holding the final thread of his sanity. He did not pull. He did not attempt to drag my warmth down to his level. He simply anchored his bruised knuckles against the freezing mud, keeping his massive head bowed deeply into my knees. The freezing mist from his resurrected lungs curled harmlessly against the worn sled of my boots, completely void of the suffocating heat that once defined his existence. The buzzing is gone. His voice was a hollow, wet scrape, entirely stripped of its ancient resonant bass. He stared down at the black ice, a thick tear cutting a clean, pale track through the drying blood on his cheek. The noise inside my skull, the demands, the fire, it is complete gone. You froze the world. You gave me the beautiful, perfect quiet. He did not apologize again. He did not flood the new razor, silver thread with weepy regret, or desperate vows of redemption. The sovereign void did not permit the chaotic clutter of emotional subtext. He understood the new biological law of our existence with terrifying clarity. He was no longer the apex gravity of the Western continent. He was a weapon stripped of its handler, handing the leash over to the absolute zero, my apathy. He slowly shifted his massive, heavily scarred frame. He did not attempt to stand tall in project dominance over the neutral alleyway. Dragged his knees backward through the slush, physically repositioning his nude body until it was situated exactly 1/2 step behind my right boot. It was the genetic, undeniable posture of high guard. He tucked his chin low, his bloodshot amber eyes scanning the frozen street, not for threats to his empire, but solely for threats to my silence. His terrifying, invincible biology was entirely, permanent repurposed. Behind us, the heavy cintron grinding of iron armor plates shattered the stillness of the morning. Commander Vance rose the freezing slush. The towering battle-scarred beta did not rush to his king. He did not extend a massive hand to pull Thorn to his feet. Vance possessed the highly tuned, instinctual radar of an elite military enforcer. His sense swept the alleyway and instantly recognized the catastrophic shift in the biological hierarchy. The suffocating, demanding siege of the Alpha, dead. Place, a vast, terrifying, bottomless ocean of freezing air dominated the atmospheric pressure. It was silence so heavy, so absolute it commanded deeper, more primal terror than a roar ever could. Vance stepped forward. His heavy iron boots crunched loudly against the ice. He stopped exactly 10 feet from the rotting wooden porch. He did not look at the massive, bleeding man kneeling obediently behind my heel. The commander of the vanguard locked his pale, hardened eyes directly onto my hollow, unreadable gaze. He unclasped the heavy iron broadsword from his armored hip. He did not present the weapon horizontally in a standard military salute. He drove the thick, lethal point of the blade directly downward, burying it inches deep in the black ice. He dropped to a single knee. He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable, unarmored flesh of his thick neck to the freezing wind. In absolute, flawless unison, the 49 remaining executioners behind him violently drove their own broadswords into frozen earth. The thunderous, echoing crash of iron strike vadalai like a localized earthquake. 49 massive lethal predators dropped to their knees, their heavy heads bowed, willing, offering their throats to the chilling, dead winter of my reign. The wind howling through the alleyway seemed to freeze mid-air, completely suffocated by the terrifying new gravity I projected. They did not howl to announce the transition of power. They held their breath, listened entirely to the void. I stood perfectly still on the splintered timber. I did not project a warm to soothe their sudden lack of gratitude, to soothe their sudden lack of a king. I did not instruct them to rise. I allowed the heavy, terrifying silence to stretch and calcify, letting the absolute permafrost of my biology seep deep into their nervous systems of dominance arrogant, tfiria maber duatayanint, tro. I slowly turned my head. I looked at the massive broken beast kneeling faithfully in the mud behind my right shoulder. The dark necrotic blood on his chest was completely frozen, binding his shred skin in a sterile, painless cast. He kept his eyes locked rigidly on the hem of my cloak, a feral guard dog eternally waiting for a command from a master who rarely spoke. I turned my gaze back to the dark, heavy timberline of the northern passage. A single dry twig snapped violently in the distant brush. The journey back to the western valley occurred in absolute, unbroken silence. The heavy winter snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets as we finally left the neutral logging town behind, rapidly erasing all previous tracks and covering the blood-soaked alleyway in a pristine layer of white. The 50 elite warriors of the vanguard did not walk around me like a suffocating, vigilant protective ring. They moved in a flawless, synchronized formation, encapsulating me at the absolute center. Thorn did not walk ahead to lead the phalanx. He did not project his chest or assert it to territorial dominance to the frozen forest. He walked exactly half-step behind my right shoulder, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of his iron-shod leather boots meticulously matching my slow, unhurried cadence. The ultimate, most brutal apex predator of the Western continent had willingly, permanently become a subservient, silent shadow beneath my heel. We passed through the massive wrought iron gates of the royal estate. Just as the sun began to set, the atmospheric pressure inside the perimeter was completely unrecognizable. The air did not carry the suffocating, sickly, sweet vanilla aromative, nor did it carry the dominant, nor did cedar of absolute dorortoi, Talad's roacal authority. The lunatic female had been permanently exiled to the frozen wildlands the exact second my decree was passed down the mountain on by Commander Vance. The entire pack, thousands of wolves, stood in absolute, breathless silence in the grand courtyard. Their heads were bowed low, their eyes fixed firmly on the packed snow, intifly as the terrifying, absolute vacuum of my sovereign void swept over them. They felt the death of their old king, and they knelt before the glacier that had replaced him. I did not return to the master den. I ordered the royal guards to drag the massive, heavy velvet bed out of the chambers and in the center of the stone courtyard. I stood on the freezing marble veranda, watching as they set ablaze. The flames roared in the tight sky, aggressive, assuming the old world, carry away the final, pathetic remnants of decades past. Desperate begging from my past life. The ancestral silver lunar crown was plucked from the cooling ashes the next morning. I did not place the heavy, ornate metal on my head. Instead, I summoned the royal blacksmith. The heat radiating from his massive stone forge was immense, but it could not warm my pale skin. I stood perfectly still by the heavy iron anvil, watching the fire devour the past, and ordered him to melt down the ancient crown, mixing that liquid silver directly with the crushed, pulverized dust of Thorn's destroyed alpha seal. I had tarnished metal. I had two simple, unadorned bands, cold, heavy, entirely equal. The new laws of the Western Empire were written not in blood, but in ice. The genetic ancient right of a dominant wolf to project gravity or use psychic pressure to force a subordinate to kneel was completely, permanently abolished. Any wolf who deliberately used their biological frequency to dominate or terrorize another would be stripped of their rank and permanently exiled in the dead zone. The ancient hierarchy was entirely flattened beneath the crushing, absolute weight of my permafrost. The pack link at the base of everyone's skull was no longer a chaotic, suffocating hive of anxious demands and territorial aggression. It became a peaceful, silent void, stabilized completely by my absolute vacuum. I stepped onto the obsidian throne at the center of the grand hall. Thorn sat in the identical stone chair beside me. He did not lean back with the arrogant, sprawling posture of a sovereign god. He sat with the absolute, rigid stillness of a royal guard. His amber eyes rarely swept the grand room for political threats. They remained permanently, obsessively locked on the pale skin of my wrist, waiting in absolute silence for a simple command I rarely ever needed to issue. The suffocating terror of his past mistakes was gone, replaced by the quiet, sterile scent of old pine, hiding safely beneath my unchanging glacier. When the time came to maintain the royal bloodline for the pack, the Fizzle Union was not born from the wild, frantic hysteria of primal mating instincts. It was deliberate, clinical, slow, and completely stripped of the toxic, arrogant ego that had gotten me slaughtered in my past life. Thorn approached my private chambers like a fragile mortal stepping up to a sacrificial altar. His rough, heavily scarred hands trembled with absolute, breathtaking reverence before daring to touch the hem of my silk nightgown. He did not seek to ignite a fire in my blood. He worshipped the cold. He worshipped my hollow glass eyes, kissing the scars on my skin as if he were drinking directly from a sacred freezing river. The children we eventually bore did not carry the suffocating golden tether of the ancient dominant bloodlines. They were born with eyes like shattered diamonds, perfectly calm, possessing the beautiful, terrifying quiet of a winter storm hidden deep within their small chests. They did not cry to demand attention. They simply existed in the perfect peace of the void. The history of supreme, invincible king and his pathetic, tragic mate was completely erased from the continent. I did not just survive his fire. He extinguished it entirely, leaving behind an empire of eternal permafrost and absolute, endless silence. Her story has come to an end. Please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.